Double standards. Double standards. Let me take a wild guess what you and I and most everybody thinks about when we use the term double standard. Here is the nostalgia critic mentioning both things that typically come to mind when the term double standard pops into conversation.
Okay, look, lady. I'm not gonna act like there isn't some double standard bullshit going on in the world. Women getting paid less than men, that's bullshit. Men sleeping around with women being called a player, but a woman sleeps around with men, she's called a slut, that's bullshit.
Does that sound about right? Is that what you were thinking? Because if it was, congratulations! You are everybody! I just gave one example of a popular person using this example. I am quite certain you can give me a hell of a lot more. This is usual. This is typical. This reaction is absolutely within the mainstream of society's thinking. So in this video, we're going to attempt to understand why this is completely absurd. Let's begin with probably the second most common example, which is the gender pay gap. The goddamn, motherfucking, fart-sniffing, baby-punching gender pay gap. You may have noticed that I get somewhat agitated when I hear its ungodly name. For me, the pay gap is the intellectual equivalent of a young earth creationist arguing that because the Bible says so, the earth is only about 6,000 years old. Even though just about every field of science, including chemistry, geology, astronomy, anthropology, fucking biology, etc., proves that that is nonsense. The whole idea of the pay gap has been debunked over and over and over and fucking over again. This is just one page of a Google search on articles debunking the pay gap. And yet it keeps crawling back into conversations time and time again, being mentioned and propagated by people you would think are functional, intelligent professionals. Even perhaps singularly the most powerful and influential person on the planet, the US president.
Over the course of her career, a working woman with a college degree will earn on average hundreds of thousands of dollars less than a man who does the same work. Now that's wrong. So to anyone who says 77 cents on the dollar sounds pretty close to equal, I say, your math is bad.
Now, we don't even need all the articles and statistics. We don't need the research and data collecting and hard facts gathered by people who prove, and have proved many times over, that the wage gap, often portrayed as 77 or 80-something cents on the dollar, doesn't exist as feminists believe it does. All we need are the simple and powerful tools that we all have called logic and common sense. So let's read the Wikipedia definition of exactly what the pay gap is and how it's typically calculated. The gender pay gap refers usually to the ratio of female to male median yearly earnings among full-time year-round workers. The female to male earnings ratio of 0.81 means that, in 2009, female full-time year-round workers earn 19% less than male full-time year-round workers. The statistic does not take into account differences in experience, skill, occupation, education, or hours worked, as long as it qualifies as full-time work. So did you get that? Take a moment to wrap your head around the implications and the methodology of this calculation. To calculate the wage gap, what we do is we lump all of the full-time working men on one side, we lump all of the full-time working women on the other, we don't ask any relevant questions about how many men or women are in the workforce, what job what sex prefers to do, or is interested in, or is physically capable of doing, or any of that. We take these two lumps, average their salaries, we notice that men's salaries tend to be higher, and we come to the natural conclusion that society is sexist and scream double standard. I just... It's so fucking stupid. I can't believe anyone of decent human intelligence can be a proponent of the wage gap. It would be like me having 100 foot races with a horse and losing every time, and then claiming the fact that it beat me every time is evidence that the horse cheated. It would be like if you take the population of the world, then take the world's most populous country, China, which is so big it's about 20% of the world's population, about 1 in 5. And then, without considering any other factors, just extrapolating that, well, anywhere you go, about 1 in 5 people speak Chinese. So yeah, you could just walk into your office or local bus station or supermarket, and if you need someone to help you translate this sentence, don't worry, because 1 out of 5 of them can speak Chinese. Let's just forget that there are 2 main different dialects of what English speakers call Chinese. Let's just forget that China is not the only country where people speak Chinese. Let's just forget that there are different concentrations of Chinese people in cities outside of China, and even if they are ethnically Chinese, if they were raised overseas, they might not be able to speak Chinese. 1 out of 5. Now, isn't that some fucking clearly erroneous logic? Can you imagine someone being so stupid as to believe that or extrapolate that idea? And yet there is no shortage of people who apply that kind of logic to the idea of the wage gap, including none other than the most public and prominent human being on the planet. Again, we don't need all the research and data and empirical evidence that had been done many times over to come to the conclusion that the wage gap doesn't exist, if our criteria for testing is just a lump sum appraisal of the average salary of all men versus all women. Let's just examine a few simple, logical propositions. Number 1. Which gender is generally less physically capable of working longer hours, more days, difficult or physically demanding jobs, dangerous or potentially hazardous jobs? Number 2. Which gender is not as socially pressured to have a good job? In other words, which gender, all things equal, is less likely to be called a loser if they live at home with their parents as an adult? Number 3. Most importantly, which gender is capable of childbirth and sometimes necessarily sidelined by it for extended periods of time? Now, if you answered female to all of these, congratulations, you do possess common sense. Now, if we applied these differences in gender to the amount of money a man will make on average, is it not reasonable to expect that the number will be naturally higher? You know, not having the possibility to put your career on hold to birth and raise children? Do you think that might possibly skew those numbers? You think? Maybe? Arguing the wage gap with a feminist, like many arguments with them, is an exercise in mindless, tooth-grinding frustration. Because immediately, you know what it's all about. You know that the logic is simple and clear and apparent to anyone with common sense. You know that they know that their idea is bullshit, and yet they will not admit it. Time and time again, they will bring it up and say, unfair, injustice to women, double standard, stand up if you love women. Because they know as well as you do that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if that number is 77 cents on the dollar, or 80 cents, or 90 cents. If there's any difference, they can always cry injustice and say, stand up if you love women, and people will stand up. That number never has been and never will be exactly the same. And even though there are logical reasons, feminists can always cry injustice. But let's take a real, no bullshit look at what feminists are trying to establish when they bring up the wage gap. The usual line of thought is they will point to a man's average pay, point out how a woman makes less on average, and say something like, why does a woman get paid less for doing the same work?
I want every child to grow up knowing that a woman's hard work is valued and rewarded just as much as any man's.
Again, it's supremely frustrating because you can see pretty clearly how it's purposefully misleading. They want to paint this picture like There are companies out there that actually write into their policies, if a man does this job, then we'll give him the full pay that any honorable penis-bearing man deserves. If it's one of those stupid female women, we'll dock her 15% just for having one of those smelly vaginas. After all, what's she gonna do about it? We're men. We control everything. Yeah, that's not what's fucking happening. I'll even play devil's advocate and say that I do think that it sometimes happens that a woman will run into cases of real sexism, where she wasn't taken seriously, or not given a fair chance to perform because she's a woman. I do think that happens, depending on the company and the people. But again, that's not a one-way street. You ever notice that when you go into a doctor's office, or a dentist's office, or elementary school classroom, there is a disproportionate number of women? Good jobs. Respectable, decent-waged, gainful employment. Do you think that many men haven't applied and been instantly passed over based on sex? Does anybody cry foul at that double standard? Does anyone give a shit? And seriously, in a day and age in which women are doctors, lawyers, CEOs of major global companies, and even heads of state, any whining over a perceived pay gap deserves to be pointed out correctly as the whining it is. So basically, getting into an argument with a feminist over the pay gap feels a lot like getting into an argument with a religious nut over the nature of the world. You see the same result. You look at the blue sky, and you ask the religious nut why it's blue. And he says, oh, that's an interesting story. You see, Cayman, the goddess of beauty and the sky, wants to show us her beauty, so every morning she puts on her blue mantle and cascades across the sky, until her jealous sister Yulan, always in black, chases her away at the coming of the night and blah-biddy-blah-biddy-blah-biddy-blah. It really remains for the rational-minded to look at the feminists arguing the pay gap and say, yes, alright, I'm seeing the same result as you. Okay, men do make more on average than women. Yes, religious dude, I agree with you. Yes, the sky is blue. The part that doesn't make sense is your explanation of why the sky is blue. Let's move on to the other really popular example of a double standard, shall we? You know, the one that goes something like, why is it that when a man sleeps around with a lot of women, he's called a player, but when a woman sleeps around with a lot of men, she's called a slut? Now this, again, is another example of the sky being blue, but to demonstrate the point that I would like to illustrate, a couple of riddles for you. What do you call a man who buys and masturbates to pornography? If you said, desperate loser, you're right. And if you said, creepy pervert, you're also right. Now, what do you call a woman who buys and masturbates to pornography? Can't think of anything? You're right again. We don't call her anything. We certainly wouldn't call her a desperate loser. She's not a creepy pervert. In fact, I want you to think about that word for a moment. Have you ever heard a woman described as creepy? What exactly does it mean? When a woman wants to discredit a man, or have people look down on a man that she doesn't like, she can just call him creepy, and usually society will take the woman at her word and prepare to defend her against this man. And yet, what did she call him? What does this word mean? Well, essentially, it just means that he's a bad person, or he has bad intentions. But whether women come out and say it or not, the truth is, the word carries an underlying sexual connotation. He's not just a bad guy who likes to kick puppies. What he really wants to do is put his thingy in someone, and ooh, gross, it's creepy, it's like a creepy spider. I don't want it to touch me, gross. Do you understand why this word doesn't apply to women? let me give you one more example of what I'm getting at. A hypothetical situation. A woman walks into a bar full of men, and in the most vulgar and shamelessly crass way announces flat out, "I'll suck all the dicks in this room." Do you think that she will soon have a realistic chance of staring down the barrel of one or several single-barrel shotguns? Now, take her male attractiveness equivalent, and it doesn't matter if you slide the scale down as long as it's equal. So compare the Janet Reno woman to the Bernie Sanders man walking into a bar full of women and loudly announcing, "I'll lick all the pussies in this room." Not only will our friend Bernie have almost no chance to do so, he'll probably find himself pepper sprayed, handcuffed, and escorted to the back of a squad car if he keeps it up. Now, slide the scale up and down, and even if you slide it to the Brad Pitt guy and the Angelina Jolie girl, the Brad Pitt guy will definitely have more success than old Bernie, but not nearly as much as the reverse porcupine effect of a million pricks trying to stab simultaneously into the Angelina Jolie girl. So why am I saying all of this? And what does it have to do with the original double standard of slut versus player? Well, if you haven't gotten the gist of what I'm getting at yet, allow me to spell it out to you as clearly as I can. A woman's sexuality is important and has intrinsic value and is seen as something special and precious just for being what it is. The word creepy doesn't apply to her because even at the very worst, even if you know that Kathy in accounts receivable wants to dust the cobwebs off her vagina just for you, it's not threatening. In fact, it's kind of cute in a harmless way. A man's sexuality, on the other hand, not only is it not special and of any intrinsic value, it is vaguely threatening and potentially criminal. A man who has successfully mated with many women is seen as a successful hunter. It's a demonstration of his prowess. He has convinced several of those special creatures to accept his potentially scary, creepy sexuality, proving that he is not creepy. A woman has nothing to prove. Whether we realize it on a conscious level or not, we already know that she has an intrinsic value. So when she treats her sexuality badly, giving it away for nothing, it's like watching a person wastefully ruining something good. Imagine how you feel if you see someone dressed in elegant, expensive-looking clothes, and then they just jump into a puddle of mud. You don't feel threatened or cautiously respectful of a strong hunter. You typically feel pity or a vague contempt for seeing someone doing something unnecessarily, stupidly wasteful. Still don't think the player versus slut double standard shows how a woman's sexuality is valuable? Let's take a journey to the magical land of pornography, where we can find hard, empirical evidence that just about anything a woman is or does can be translated into money. Aside from the obvious sexual body parts, any part of a woman's body, even body parts that no amount of diet and exercise can really change, even they can be fetishized and desired. A woman doing just about anything, peeing into a cup, sitting on a toilet, fucking farting in someone's face. All of it is market-demanded, sellable, money-making content. Fat women, old, ugly women, it doesn't matter. Many magazines will happily announce how old and fat the women inside are. If a vagina is involved, you can find eager consumers. Good luck finding subscribers to Fat Hairy Loser Monthly. Honestly, we don't even need to go to porno to demonstrate a woman's intrinsic value. Just go to any type of advertisement, and even if it has nothing to do with women, an attractive, fresh female face will be used because tacitly it implies that it's safe. It's not creepy. Look, we got a woman involved. See, it's not scary at all. It gets an instant attractiveness and credibility just because it's a woman. We have two classic, often cited examples that always come to mind when we mention the topic double standard. and on clear inspection, they are both woefully insubstantial. So why, I ask, do we give so much thought and attention to these two trivial examples of double standards? And yet the very real double standard of who dies more often, in virtually every circumstance, gets flat ignored, like it means nothing to no one. Homicides. While the good news is that they've gone down in recent years in America, we can notice that the rate among men is always about 3 times higher than women. Military conscription. The only sex we force, with or without their personal consent, to go to war and potentially kill and die is male. These figures are taken from different countries, different years, and different sources, but they all seem to accord with each other generally. Remember when I talked about jobs men and women are physically capable of doing? The most hazardous jobs all over the world seem to be fishers, loggers, pilots, steel workers, and trash collectors. And barring pilots, all of those jobs rely to a greater degree on physical strength. And if you look at the bottom of this chart, this is from America 2009, by the way. Fatalities by gender. For every 100 killed on the job, 93 of them will be men. That is what is called a fucking double standard. And if you look next to that, the fatalities by ethnicities show that most of them are white. Yes, the very people feminists tell us are the evil, privileged, patriarchal dominators of society, they are the ones most likely to end up dying on the job in service to society. Now, am I suggesting that a 50-50 death ratio among men and women is preferable? No, not at all. I think most men don't mind their higher chances of dying so much if they feel that society understands and honors that sacrifice. Generally, men are the ones who inflict and also absorb violence. That is what they are more biologically suited for. And it doesn't seem instinctually unfair like it does when a woman absorbs violence. What I'm saying is, this is a man's fate. And if women want every aspect of life to be 50-50 with a man, or else complain that it's not fair, then they should be willing to suffer a man's fate. And if they're not willing to, and society is not ready to do that, there is no dishonor in that. It just means that if we're willing to ask men to jump into the meat grinder for the sake of society, fighting our wars, doing the dangerous but necessary jobs, we need to give them the proper respect. The reason that feminism bothers me so much is that almost every talking point they throw out, like double standards, is wildly imbalanced. Men are dominators. Men are toxic. Men are all potential rapists. Be afraid of them. Forgetting the fact that no matter how misleading the statistics can be, no matter what study is cited, the vast majority of men don't rape, would never rape, do not beat and abuse the women in their lives, are actually willing to make sacrifices to protect the women in their lives. Criminals are the minority of society. Their behavior is classified as criminal specifically because it is not normal. Yet feminists will take that criminal behavior and attribute it to all men, ignoring all of the ones who made great sacrifices on their behalf. So feminist jokes like this, or these, just go to show me how spoiled and unaware most of them really are.